Welcome to the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. The Defense Horizon Journal is a professional and academic journal that features essays, reports, and analyses covering geopolitics and law, security and defense policy, peace and conflict studies, applied military science, as well as developments in weapons technology. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org.
Episode number 20. High-Finder Competition, Deception, and Ground Maneuver on the Transparent Battlefield. By Timothy J. Rizza and Michelle Weiss. The Virtuous Battlefield. The Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 has become a major inflection point of the 21st century. Besides marking the return of conventional land warfare in Europe, it is also said to potentially bring about the demise of the post-Cold War security architecture and the so-called liberal democratic order. From a military point of view, the war in Ukraine appears to simultaneously represent a shock of the old and serve as a harbinger of the future battlefield. On the one hand, fighting on the ground has largely settled into positional warfare, with the war's attritional character prompting many comparisons to World War I. On the other hand, this bogged-down state of affairs the war's major novel aspect, the integration of large amounts of sensors, particularly inexpensive UAV platforms, many of them commercially off-the-shelf, COTS, alongside other C4ISTAR, command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance capabilities enable near-continuous battlefield surveillance. Paired with a modern, multispectral Recce precision strike complex, reconnoitered targets can be engaged within minutes. Command posts, arms depots, and lines of communication need to be placed out of the enemy's weapons range to ensure their survivability. Large-scale military operations seem increasingly impossible as maneuver forces can be detected early on and held at risk even while generating combat power in their staging areas. As the former Chief of Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Gen. Valery Zaluzhny, put it, the simple fact is that we see everything the enemy is doing, and they see everything we are doing. In short, modern warfare may finally approach the condition of the long-anticipated, transparent battlefield. Such a transparent battlefield, or in other words, a comprehensive battlefield awareness, has long been seen as a key enabler for future warfighting concepts. For several years, the U.S. Department of Defense has been working on the so-called Joint All-Domain Command and Control (JADC2) project, which seeks to produce the warfighting capability to sense, make sense, and act at all levels and phases of war, across all domains, and with partners, to deliver information advantage at the speed of relevance for the U.S. Joint Force. As part of JADC2, the different U.S. armed services developed their own C4ISTAR projects, including the U.S. Army's Project Convergence, the Navy's Project Overmatch, and the Air Force's Advanced Battle Management System. Consequently, the U.S. Army emphasizes situational awareness and information advantage as a crucial requirement for mission success throughout its current Field Manual FM 3-0 operations, the official doctrine for multi-domain operations, MDO. According to FM 3-0, MDO seeks to apply kinetic and non-kinetic effects from all domains against enemy-led standoff fire and air defense complexes to enable ground maneuver. Beyond the U.S. Army, several European countries are in the process of experimenting with or are already implementing MDO approaches. However, their conceptual foundations and their understanding of what MDO exactly entails show considerable variation. On the one hand, small and medium-sized militaries face significant material constraints, compelling them to try and avoid a military strategy based on attrition. On the other hand, however, it is uncertain whether they could mobilize the resources necessary to develop and employ a comprehensive MDO framework against peer or even overmatched adversaries. The origins of the transparent battlefield and multi-domain operations. The notion of a transparent battlefield or battle space, as well as ultimately the idea of MDO, can be traced back to decades-long and still ongoing developments in the so-called Revolution in Military Affairs, RMA. According to conventional wisdom, RMA's origins go back to the United States and NATO's offset strategy following the Vietnam War, which sought to balance Soviet numerical superiority in Europe with a qualitative edge, made possible by novel technological developments, including microprocessors and lasers. Leveraging these new technologies, land-, air-, and sea-launched precision-guided munitions, terminally guided to targets at standoff ranges through command, control, and automated. Reconnaissance and target acquisition systems were supposed to break an enemy assault effectively without crossing the nuclear threshold. While these developments and concepts in the US were mainly viewed as a means to retain a technological advantage versus the Soviet Union, the latter's defense establishment increasingly perceived them as potentially revolutionary changes altering the character of war. Beginning in the mid-1970s, the Soviets conceived these changes as a military technological revolution, MTR, with the so-called reconnaissance strike complex at its center. It was only after studying the Soviet MTR concepts that US defense intellectuals, in particular the Office of Net Assessment, ONA, led by Andrew Marshall, began to incrementally realize the potentially revolutionary changes in warfare, describing them as a revolution in military affairs, RMA. At the beginning of the 1990s, following the First Gulf War and research on its preliminary lessons relating to the impact of information technologies on the design and execution of military operations, as well as a comprehensive study about the MTR by the ONA, the US began to increasingly embrace the RMA as the way in which the US would fight and win future wars. The vision at the time was to transform the US armed forces using technological advances in areas such as C4I, stealth, precision guidance as well as ISR. The RMA also influenced related warfighting concepts including network-centric warfare, which emphasizes the synergies of interconnected platforms, as well as effects-based operations, focusing on creating specific effects on the adversary's behavior to bring about the desired end state rather than to annihilate the enemy or wear him out through attrition. Proponents of the RMA have typically pointed to NATO intervention in Kosovo in 1999 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in 2002 to 2003, as well as Desert Storm, as a precursor, as proof of concept for their ideas. While the US armed forces enjoyed a competitive advantage in the late 1999s and early 2000s, military strategists and defense officials soon began to warn that this would not be lasting. One contemporary study from the early 2000s identified increasing battle space transparency as one sphere of competition, noting that, given current trends, the ISR information available to prospective adversaries is almost certain to improve significantly over the next 2 decades. The advantage in this area that the United States enjoys today could diminish considerably in relative terms. Several prospective adversaries, for example, actively pursuing the development of high-flying, inherently low observable UAVs capable of performing theater-wide ISR missions. A few are building various kinds of remote sensing satellites, e.g., China, while others are gaining access to high-resolution satellite imagery by purchasing it from commercial suppliers. Hyperspectral and high-resolution radar imaging services are likely to become commercially available within the next several years. Many states are also learning how to network widely dispersed, disparate sensors into an integrated system that is more powerful than the sum of its parts. Indeed, studying closely the wars discussed above and the US Armed Forces transformation, Russia and the People's Republic of China, PRC, as well as weaker rivals such as North Korea and Iran, began developing their own solutions to deal with the prospect US power projection, which have been typically characterized as so-called anti-access area denial, A2AD, strategies. While the US and its allies were busy conducting counterinsurgency campaigns throughout the Middle East and the broader Islamic world, peer adversaries such as the PRC and Russia invested in capabilities that would delay or even disrupt US access to unimpeded maneuver within operational theaters. The emergence of MDO as a warfighting concept has to be understood in this specific context. MDO, in its original US formulation, is the combined arms employment of joint and army capabilities to create and exploit relative advantages that achieve objectives, defeat enemy forces, and consolidate gains. MDO seeks to defeat enemy capabilities, in particular standoff fire complexes and air defense, by fracturing the coherence of threat operational approaches by destroying, dislocating, isolating, and disintegrating their independent systems and formations. According to the Bundswar, as Phillips notes, MDO is focused on creating windows of opportunity that offer freedom of action for maneuver by the joint force and, in particular, ground forces. Other nations, such as the United Kingdom, UK, have equally embraced MDO as the model for future warfighting, with the British Chief of the General Staff, General Sir Patrick Sanders, in 2022 arguing that Success will be determined by combined arms and multi-domain competence. The challenges of implementing an MDO approach. While numerous countries are in the process of adopting or have already implementing multi-domain operations as their warfighting concepts, critical observers have pointed to a number of challenges that they will likely encounter. Generally, warfighting concepts such as MDO are often highly optimistic, uncoordinated with other services and allies, and lack any clear theory of success. As has been noted repeatedly, several states have different approaches to what multi-domain entails, including in their qualifiers ranging from the British multi-domain integration to the French multimiliax multichamps and the German multidimensionalität. Establishing a cohesive doctrine with a unified agreed-upon terminology will already prove challenging at the national level between the different armed service branches and much more so at the international or multilateral level. The same issue has been pointed out regarding interoperability and technological integration, not only at the international level between different armed forces but also between classified and unclassified systems. One detailed study of different MDO concepts found several additional challenges that will impact implementation. First, most concepts exhibit technological overconfidence, especially regarding communications where they assume, implicitly or not, assured connectivity at a hardly realistic level. Indeed, efforts to create the required network architecture, such as JADC2, have now barely reached an initial operational capability and are likely still years, or even decades, away from maturity. As such, it is doubtful when and to what extent any state will be able to attain a comprehensive MDO capability. Other observers have also cast doubt on the ability to fight an enemy as envisioned by MDO doctrine, namely, paralyzing and imposing multiple dilemmas on him. As Michael Kaufman points out, the operational realities of fights with either Russia or China do not accommodate many of the concepts envisioned, as war with such peer competitors is likely to be bloody, costly, and potentially protracted. All of these potentials pertain to any country seeking to implement an MDO concept. In consequence, this means that small and medium-sized powers will face even more considerable hurdles. For many smaller and medium-sized militaries, achieving anything even approximating a true MDO capability will likely entail considerable investments across several domains, with their capacity to do so being doubtful. Take, for instance, Denmark, which in May 2023 announced it would invest close to $21 billion in its armed forces, yet in July 2024, the Danish armed forces experienced problems paying daily expenses and subsequently cancelled its participation in 2 NATO exercises. Some MDO proponents advocate investing into low-cost surveillance and sensor-to-shooter networks, in particular, COTS UAVs. Yet this raises again the question of integration. Multi-domain denial. In short, investing in an MDO capability will likely be a losing proposition for small and medium-sized militaries. Instead of trying to catch up with potential peers or even overmatched adversaries, they should consider investing in capabilities that can deny their enemies' MDOs relative advantages. As noted by the Bundeswehr, MDO's prerequisite and defining feature is comprehensive and uninterrupted networking. The operational environment needs the highest possible degree of transparency for its own forces to initiate sensor-to-shooter loops, or kill chains, respectively, as quickly as possible. In other words, degrading and defeating such a network through various denial and deception measures would significantly impede an adversary's ability to field their multi-domain capability. Consequently, smaller and medium-sized military powers do not need their own MDO concept to retain the capacity for selective maneuver. Instead, they need to deny this capability to their own opponent. This is the essence of what we call multi-domain denial. Achieving it entails both passive and active measures and likely a combination thereof. Passive measures include the use of multispectral camouflage as well as a range of decoys to deceive an adversary and hide one's own forces and movement from the latter's sensor. Multispectral camouflage nets, for example, can hide assets from radar and infrared and are relatively inexpensive, with the French army reportedly signing a contract on the procurement of 3,000 nets for approximately $21.6 million. Furthermore, there is ongoing research to produce multispectral camouflage using additive technology, potentially further decreasing costs in the future. Decoys are another passive measure that was widely utilized during the Russo-Ukrainian War. While historically being in use for several centuries, modern decoys are able to emit fake radar and infrared signatures, thus fooling enemy reconnaissance. While the costs of such decoys vary, a Ukrainian company has produced howitzer decoys resembling the M777 type at around $1,000. Active measures, meanwhile, include the employment of electronic warfare to disturb enemy surveillance. This can be achieved through numerous techniques, including the jamming and/or jamming of radars, communications, or GPS/GNSS. Researchers have also noted how AI and machine learning can be potentially leveraged by designing nonsensical images with AI and paint them on the battle space using decoys, fake signal traffic, and careful arrangements of genuine hardware that could render multi-billion-dollar sensor systems useless because the data they collect would be incomprehensible to both AI and human analysts. Active measures may also include selected kinetic, cyber or other attacks against detected and reconnoitered enemy C4ISTA infrastructure to facilitate friendly freedom of action. One of the challenges of carrying out such measures will be coordination and synchronization across different domains. At the same time, this will be essential considering that in an era of increasingly widespread, sophisticated, and varied sensors, spoofing only one type does little against an adversary capable of rapidly fusing multiple sources of information. 58. As such, multi-domain denial takes a doubling meaning. Not only does it seek to deny the enemy their MDO capability by degrading and disrupting their battle space awareness, but such denial and deception itself has to occur across several domains. Learning from the past. Studying historical examples can further inform the basic tenets of the multi-domain denial approach. One particularly useful case is maritime warfare, particularly the idea of sea control. Has been defined as acquiring and securing the privilege to utilize the maritime space in the period of time as expected. Naval doctrine has long recognized the spatial and temporal limits of sea control. As the U.S. Navy's capstone document notes, sea control does not imply absolute control over all the seas at all times. Rather, control of the sea is required in specific regions for particular periods of time, to allow unencumbered maritime operations. However, sea denial, or the exclusion of adversaries from utilizing the maritime space in an expected period of time and place of choosing, needs to be considered in parallel. While sea control typically includes the capacity to impose sea denial on the adversary, the opposite is not necessarily the case. Consequently, some maritime schools of thought have focused exclusively on denying their enemies the ability to use the maritime domain. The primary example of such thinking was the French Jeune École, which advocated investing in a large fleet of small and fast torpedo boats to attack commercial shipping rather than in a relatively small number of capital ships to seek a decisive battle. As the thought leader of the Jeune École, Vice Admiral Hyacinth Laurent Théophile Aube, noted, "Tomorrow war breaks out, an autonomous torpedo boat, 2 officers, a dozen men, meets one of these liners carrying a cargo richer than that of the richest galleons of Spain and a crew and passengers of many hundreds. The torpedo boat will follow from afar, invisible, the liner it has met, and, once night has fallen, perfectly silently and tranquilly, it will send into the abyss liner, cargo, crew, passengers." While many of Aube's arguments were dubious at best, and the torpedo boat soon found its match in torpedo boat destroyers, he correctly anticipated the impact of the torpedo on naval warfare as well as the importance of commercial warfare. Some observers have argued that the Houthis' interdiction campaign against commercial shipping in the Red Sea may be read as a new twist on the Jeune École's core tenets. Jeune École identified the delta in cost between warships and ship-killing weapons, notes Kevin McCraney, and since then, warships have become even more expensive and technologies to attack them have proliferated. After several months of disrupting commerce in the Red Sea, maritime operations by the U.S. Navy and several allied nations still have not managed to contain the threat as world's premier navies appear to be struggling to subdue a band of insurgents. The takeaway is that actors with relatively low capacity do not need to establish control over a certain domain to deny it to their adversaries. Furthermore, as past examples from high-defined competitions in aerial and submarine warfare show, a wholly transparent battlefield is likely a mirage. Like the development of radar and advanced air defense systems spurred countermeasures from releasing chaff to flares to electronic countermeasures and building low observable stealth aircraft, so do submarines rely on sonar countermeasures. In consequence, the employment of passive and active measures to degrade and disrupt the enemy's C4 capability, battle space awareness, and, as such, reduce the transparency of the battlefield, rather than attempting to implement a fully-fledged MDO approach, is a more promising pathway towards attaining the freedom of action to engage in selective maneuver, especially when combined with the inherent advantages of the defense such as terrain or preparation. What needs to be done? Small and medium-sized military powers looking to improve their defensive potential may be well advised to consider if an operational concept geared towards superpowers such as the US is suitable for them. Instead of simply replicating the American way of warfare, they should attempt to identify the choke points in the MDO approach. As MDO proponents tend to agree, battle space awareness C4 capabilities are one such point, as it is widely seen as MDO's prerequisite characteristic. Consequently, small military powers should reinvest in their deception capabilities, including passive and active measures. This will necessitate considerable institutional and intellectual change, considering that deception has long been marginalized in Western militaries and their ability to conduct such techniques and tactics has consequently declined. While tactical deception could likely be incorporated into exercises with relative ease, developing deception capabilities at the operational or even strategic level will require far greater efforts. It is also important to note the limitations of our paper, as our argument rests on certain assumptions about levels of ambition. In other words, the approach we suggest is primarily suitable for armed forces following a predominantly defensive doctrine. On the other hand, members of an alliance such as NATO, which has long emphasized expeditionary warfare and power projection among its major capabilities, cannot aim exclusively for such a conception and will not get around an MDO approach entirely. At the same time, these approaches need not to be mutually exclusive. As NATO, in the words of some of its officials, is shifting from expeditionary operations, the success of a new collective defense posture hinges on member nations' ability to meet these requirements. Especially smaller allied member states might do well to consider investing in their deception and denial capabilities to meet such expectations. The authors: First Lieutenant Timothy J. Rizza is an officer in the Armored Forces, the future commander of a mechanized staff company and a career officer candidate at the Military Academy, MILAC, at ETH Zurich. He recently completed his BA thesis on the utility of military deception in multi-domain operations, which is also one of his main research interests. Specialist Officer, Captain Michel Weiss, M.A., is a scientific assistant for strategic studies at MILAC and a PhD candidate at Leiden University. He is co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Proxy Wars, and his research has been published in International Security, the Journal of Strategic Studies, and International Studies Review, among others. The views contained in this article are the authors alone and do not represent the views of the Swiss Armed Forces or any other agency of the Swiss government.
This was the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org. Thank you for listening.